Good morning, Bob.
Good morning.
So this morning we're going to continue talking about the latest developments in the president's um, calling up of the National Guard and deployment of the Marines into Los Angeles. There's been a new development in the last 24 hours. There's been a lot of new developments, but the main one is a complaint filed by California against the federal government, arguing that the calling up of the National Guard was illegal. So let's talk about that, and then we'll talk about other aspects of what's going on. What did you think of the complaint?
I don't see that it succeeds. I think the complaint, just to give a little bit of background, the complaint tries to put before the court a theory about what the government owes, or the federal government owes the governor under 12406, a statute under which the president has called the National Guard into service. And the argument there is, and it's not the only argument, but let me just lead with that because I think that's, in effect, the more statutorily grounded argument here, that any orders that the president issued pursuant to the memorandum had to have been order issued through the governor, and that was not the case. And so, as a result of that, there's a procedural defect, and his invocation of the 12406 as the basis for federalization of the Guard was defective. Uh, I don't know that I can see that succeeding. That seems to be, as at least one commentator said, an administrative position. The statute calls for the orders to be issued through the governor. It doesn't make any specific reference to gubernatorial consent or to consultation. And by the way, the complaint itself moves around a little bit. It alleges a procedural defect, but it also refers to the requirement of either consent or, at one point in the complaint, a reference to input and consultation. And I don't see that in the statute. And so I don't know that that is going to be successful. That's the one piece that I bring up first. And let me turn this back to you and see whether you had a similar or a different reaction.
I agree completely. This is the least bad argument. It's the only colorable argument in the complaint that the statute, as you said, requires that the orders to federalize the National Guard shall be issued by the governor, and the claim is that it wasn't. The complaint is a little obfuscating or not completely candid, I think. It says that the Secretary of Defense actually sent a memorandum to the Adjutant General of California, and I think this was probably a memorandum, if I had to guess, although the complaint didn't say it, asking the governor to actually issue these orders. And it says that the Adjutant General of California sent those on to the governor, but then the governor did not give his consent. Well, I don't think the governor has the authority to give consent. I think that, in fact, you can read 12406 to say that the government, it's a ministerial function. That the authorities here, in my view, if if the triggering criteria are satisfied, and we can talk about that, don't give the governor, as you suggested, any discretion not to issue these orders. So I suspect that what happened here, at least it seems based on the California complaint, and I'm speculating, is that DOD actually went through the process of asking the governor to issue these orders, and then Newsom, it appears, declined to do so. And he's suggesting, as you said, that he has a consent veto over this deployment, and that's just contrary to how these statutes work.
Let me ask you a question about your assertion that the governor was asked in the first instance. There seems to be a significant disagreement, by the way, as a background to this complaint and a background to the sort of more, I'd say, overarching argument here that there's something constitutionally defective about the president's attempt to deprive the governor of control of the National Guard in California. There seems to be some disagreement about whether the administration engaged with the governor at all. The president said he warned the governor that he would send in troops if state and local authorities couldn't manage the situation. The governor says that conversation never took place. Um, that's a background fact. Is there any legal relevance to it whatsoever in your view?
I mean, I don't believe so. We don't. I think that Newsom and Trump had a conversation late last week. They reported differently on the content of the conversation. Newsom has basically asserted that he wasn't consulted before this order came down. But I don't see there's a provision of the Insurrection Act that contemplates a request by a governor before the president can exercise authorities. That is not what this statute says. This statute does not require the consent of the governor. It doesn't not require consultation with the governor. All it says is that the order shall be issued through the governor. And that did not happen, but it's not clear if it happened, why it didn't happen. And if I had to guess, and this is just a guess, based on the complaint, it's because Newsom didn't carry out his ministerial duty. I don't know that. I want to emphasize it's an inference that I'm reading into what California said in the complaint. But I don't. The complaint asserts a government's the governor's right to consent, as if the governor had a veto right over the federalization, and that's not the case.
There's also, and again, I'm not sure how to characterize it, but it's another count in the complaint, an argument that in the circumstances here, there was not a basis for the president to deprive the governor of control of the National Guard, that by federalizing the National Guard, he's handicapped the government of California because the governor can no longer call on the assistance for other purposes, like control of wildfires, should it happen, of the 4,000 or so members of the California National Guard. I didn't see that that was put in a doctrinally compelling way, but I just want to see whether I might be missing something.
Are you talking about whether the substantive criteria have been met in 12406 for the calling up of the National Guard?
Yeah, my sense also is, and again, maybe I'm reading too much into it, or maybe not reading enough into it, that sort of weaving in and out of this complaint is an attempt to say there's a huge 10th Amendment problem here. There was no basis for the president to do what he did here, and the net effect is to handicap the government of California in a way that is simply not justified by actual conditions on the ground. I mean, I'm not putting it maybe as precisely.
No, I agree.
I,
Now, there's an explicit 10th Amendment argument after the argument we just went through, and I just think it's extraordinarily weak. I mean, the Constitution is explicit in giving the Congress the authority to regulate the calling up of the militia. It is done so here with fairly clear statutory language. Now, there's a question about whether the substantive criteria have been satisfied. The statute contemplates the federalization of the National Guard when there's a danger of rebellion, but we could argue about whether there's a danger of rebellion in light of what's going on right now in Los Angeles. But I'm quite confident that the president will receive significant deference on that judgment. So I just don't see a plausible 10th Amendment argument if the statute is satisfied, which I believe it is.
The complaint uses a dictionary definition to suggest that there's a problem with the administration trying to shoehorn what it's doing here under the rebellion portion of 12406, the statute in question. They cite a dictionary definition to the effect that this must mean sort of essentially a concerted effort to overthrow the government, sort of some sort of comprehensive challenge to government authority, as opposed to scattered street protests. Now that has intuitive power. I mean, one of the problems with what's taking place in California, in my view, is that there's no obvious reason why the federal government would have concluded that California couldn't control this matter on its own. Normally, I'm going to stress normally, in circumstances like this, the federal government would consult with the governor, and on obtaining reassurance from the governor that the state and local authorities had the matter in hand, and observing that that was apparently the case, they wouldn't do what Donald Trump did here. And so when we get a little bit later into the conversation, I hope we could talk a little bit about the politics here. Nonetheless, I do think that there's an attempt here, and I don't think it'll be availing. I don't think it'll be successful to say, hey, wait a minute, let's put some common sense into the definition of rebellion. These are street protests, and they're out of hand, and there's violence, and it's unacceptable. There are attacks on ICE officers, unacceptable, but it's not a rebellion. I mean, that does have intuitive power, but not legal force. Is that a fair way to look at it?
I mean, I would, first of all, the statute says rebellion or danger of rebellion. So it contemplates circumstances short of rebellion. Yes, there is a sense of rebellion that requires much greater force against the federal government than this. Is that the only operative definition of rebellion for purposes of this statute? I don't know, but I doubt it. And there's also wiggle room given danger of rebellion. There's also a different provision, which not clear. You could argue that it was also relied on a different provision of this statute that triggers the president's power to federalize here when the president is unable with the regular forces to execute the laws of the United States. We could have a debate about whether that was really satisfied here. The truth is, we don't really, I can't figure out, based on news reporting, exactly how serious this threat is, what danger it ultimately poses, whether there's, I mean, this is something that hasn't been noted enough. The president's memorandum authorizing the federalization of the National Guard was not limited to California. It is a general authorization that applies throughout the country. And they could be anticipating, as we've been hearing about, bigger protests. So I just think on the question of danger of rebellion, the president is going to, there might be dictionary definitions of rebellion, certainly, that require much more than we see here. But I think the danger of rebellion and the president's call that he's unable with regular forces to execute the law is going to get a lot of deference from the courts. And I don't see the courts second guessing the president on that issue.
I suspect you're right. I mean, California is before the court, and this is also in the complaint, with something of a chronology to try to underscore 2 points: that these were protests. I mean, this was not a concerted effort to overthrow the government of California or the government of the United States. They turned violent. And secondly, the state and local authorities responded appropriately. And there are a lot of references to what LAPD did to try to bring this unrest under control. So, and this sort of gets to maybe a question, we don't have to rush into it, but a question of what California is trying to do here. In what way is it trying to get the attention of the court in circumstances in which its lawyers must know that this is an extraordinary uphill battle? And
I wonder what you think about that, because I have to say this complaint seems self-defeating to me. It seems like I don't know what the federal district court will do, but it seems bound to lose ultimately and quickly. And therefore one wonders why, if we're right about that, and I think we agree to different degrees with that, why does California file this complaint? I mean, what message is it trying to send? Because I don't think it's trying to win the legal argument.
I don't know whether anybody whatsoever in the core of lawyers who prepared this for California, think it might have some chance of winning or not. But I mean, they certainly can't think it's a slam dunk or that they should be betting on victory. So, first of all, I suspect California thought it needed to make a point. It had to do something. And a clear way of making the point was to file a lawsuit and to claim that what we're seeing here was outside the authority of the president constitutionally, and it's a matter of statutory compliance outside the authority of the president. And that's the way they could make that point, other than politically. They're in a courtroom making an argument. Secondly, I think they are.
Finish your thought, and I have a question.
Sure. And the second thing is to put a generous frame on what they've done here. With a Republican Congress not making any noise at all, and you've made the point, by the way, that this memorandum is not limited to the state of California. The question is, what mechanism of accountability is there? And they may have thought, look, we may lose it, but the only mechanism for accountability, win or lose, lies with the courts. And then thirdly, I think probably what they have in mind is maybe they get the attention of the judge on something, and again, I suppose this falls in the category of an intuitive judicial response. Something's not right here. Take at least a look at this. This is all wrong. They leaped to do this when there was no reason for them to do it. And they escalated very quickly from the deployment of thousands of National Guardsmen and women to sending in the Marines. Something's wrong here. So we may not be able to put this in the right legal packaging, but we want you to take a look at it. And, maybe in oral argument, they have California in front of a judge. They have the government in front of a judge. And the judge asks the government some uncomfortable questions before ruling in the government's favor. And they've made some kind of point here. They've underscored there is something wrong here.
Except that the likely outcome here is a judicial decision saying California does not have any legal, does not have a sound legal argument here, and making quite clear that the federal government does have the authority to issue this order. I mean, that's the more likely outcome. And no matter what happens in oral argument, again, we could be wrong. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm misreading the statute and misreading what's happening in Los Angeles. But I think that's the overwhelmingly likely outcome, at least on appeal. I don't know what the district court will do, but I think it's the best reading of the law as I understand it. And so if the likely outcome is a ruling, and there were some clear errors of law in the complaint. I mean, they were really overstating the governor's power vis-a-vis the federal government in this context. And that is going to be shot down by the federal courts. And so what are you getting in the interim if with the ultimate outcome, and probably pretty quickly, is a ruling saying that the president properly exercises authorities? And I would emphasize we don't know what's going to happen next. And there has been a rather large deployment thus far, but I think it's important to emphasize, and this is going to bring us to a point that I know you've been concerned with. It's important to emphasize that the authority being asserted here is kind of a defensive authority, protecting federal government property, protecting federal government functions, and not using the military in a way, at least overtly, or not using the military in a way that's actually enforcing the law. So I think that the federal government is on stronger ground in emphasizing that function, and it's also a narrower function than the president could have achieved by invoking the Insurrection Act. So I think that's the context. But I know you have concerns with that limitation. I mean, you think that that limitation might not be a strong one.
Yes, and let me get to that, but just very quickly double back to the point you made about the futility of the lawsuit. So I mentioned oral argument. You could also imagine a circumstance in which, apart from the government flailing around in a factual exchange with the court about the conditions on the ground and whether or not they actually ever consulted the governor, irrespective again of whether it has any bearing on the outcome of the lawsuit, you could imagine an opinion, given what I think are the extraordinary circumstances here that do not tell in favor of the government at all, an opinion in which the court says, you know what, we're really troubled by all of this, but our hands are tied. There's nothing we can do. The president has enormous discretion here. The statutory argument is unavailing. The 10th Amendment argument just simply doesn't cut, it doesn't pass muster. But courts certainly have been known more in the past to use some language expressing sort of reluctance that they had to reach that result. And maybe California is looking for that would be something. And again, an accountability measure that it can't find anywhere else. You would think, by the way, I mean, again, goes to the question of what we think about presidents exercising this kind of authority, that there'd be members of Congress on both sides of the aisle that would be expressing, not just on the Democratic side, real concern about the authority that's been claimed here and the use that's been made of it. But that's not going to happen in this Republican-controlled Congress, and certainly not an issue where I think there's generally perceived to be, at least in the president's world, a lot of good politics for him to extract from the situation. But anyway, I'll pause there. Is there anything more you want to talk about that? And then I'll go.
I mean, I just don't. I don't see how a court wringing its hands saying, if it does this, we really think this is a bad thing, but there's nothing we can do about it. I just don't see how that helps the situation and helps California. I don't think the Supreme Court will end up saying that on its emergency orders docket if it has to go there. And so I just don't see how that's on balance helpful to the state of California. And look, I agree that no one on the Republican side in Congress is going to be questioning the president's authorities here, although in different circumstances they would. But I don't think we can discount completely the danger here. I mean, there have been attacks, as you know, as you said, on federal officers. There have been attacks on federal property. These things can get out of control quickly. We saw them get out of control a lot during Trump's first term. I think that if this were a normal president and we weren't suspicious of this president's good faith and compliance with the law, this would, I think, be a reasonable thing for a president to do. Yes, I agree. The president would have consulted, a normal president would have consulted more with the governor. But given the kind of fairly restrained nature of what the president is calling up is nationalizing the National Guard and sending in the Marines to do, I just think that it's important to realize that there's a danger on the other side as well. And this is the problem. This is the problem with these statutes. And let me just make the big picture point and then turn it over to your concern. The problem with these statutes, the concern with these statutes, with the Insurrection Act and with the open-ended, the president's very broad authority to nationalize the federal guard, the president's broad authority to use Article 2 to use the military for the protective function, the insurrection acts themselves. The central problem is that it's very important. It's written in the Constitution that the federal government have the authority to use federal forces when there are extreme circumstances in the states. And this has been a feature of federal law. It's in the Constitution and since the founding. The problem is, and that's a necessary feature, I think, of federal authority. The problem has always been how can you control the president's discretion and make sure this isn't abused? And the statutes as currently written provide very few real legal constraints, very few procedural constraints, time constraints, and the like on the president. So and we think of the president as the person who exercises discretion both in determining what's an emergency and in figuring out what forms of force can be used to meet the emergency. And this is the last thing I'll say, presidents throughout history have been more or less restrained in the use of this authority. There have been exceptions, but precisely because the politics doesn't work well for them, it's a dangerous thing to do politically. The military doesn't like it. But this is what we discussed yesterday. It's a point worth making again today. It's difficult to draft these statutes that both empower the president enough and constrain the president enough. We proposed, lots of people proposed putting 30-day constraints on these authorities to require Congress to get into the action, so to speak, to force them to get into the action. That did not get any traction in the last 4, 5, 6 years. So here we are, and here we are. So tell us about your concern about the order as it's written.
Yeah, and by the way, I'm not dodging it. I promise I'll get to it. I just have to come back to one thing you said just to ask you about this. Yes, you say this authority is written into the Constitution and has been sanctioned by constitutional and presidential practice over the years. But scholars, and I have in mind here Chris Mersola, have made the point that over time we've also seen the executive push in a fashion that's really not grounded in the constitutional history and in the authorities, push very, very hard in the direction of an expansive view of the protective function and an expansive view of emergency authority. So there's been some, unmooring of this claim from its proper foundations over time. Would you agree with that?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, because the protective power. So I was talking about the statutory authorizations.
Okay.
The protective power, I agree with Chris's article in questioning the foundations of it. I mean, there's a lot you could do to question the foundations of the protective power asserted by the president. This is the power, again, that the president claims under Article 2 to protect federal property, persons, and functions. And it's where that gets tied into the Constitution is a contested matter. There are some Supreme Court cases that aren't really directly on point, but the executive branch has relied on. The problem is the president has been asserting this authority for 150, 160 years. And it is a defensive authority to protect federal property and functions. And if you're talking about the protective power being unmoored from its foundations, its primary foundations are in long historical practice, which is a primary basis for the development of federal power. It underlies lots of federal power. So Chris's article is excellent on this. It's in the Harvard National Security Journal. I highly recommend it. It's the best definitive article on this issue. But whether this is, I wouldn't say it's an illegitimate power. I definitely wouldn't say that. Although the Supreme Court has never blessed it as it's been practiced by the president.
Okay, so let me get to the question I have about the invocation of 12406 and something that I've been concerned about. And you and I've had conversations offline and have not been in agreement about this, or at least I think I've overstated my case, which is almost certainly true. I want to begin by saying that I just don't come out in favor of what the government has done here, or even, let me put it to you differently, because I'm clearly not in favor of what the government did here. I just don't think that this is a good faith exercise of the president's authority under these statutes, even as generously construed as presidents construe them. I think it's very clear in normal cases, presidents consult with governors and view the exercise of this kind of authority, the deployment of the National Guard and the troops, as extraordinary and they go about doing things in a certain way that we think will be constrained by good judgment and norms. They want to tamp down and not inflame conflict. This president, for political reasons, wants to inflame the conflict. And I think there is evidence already in the public record. They were very anxious to do what they've done. And then they supplemented the National Guard deployment for reasons that are completely mysterious to me, with sending in the Marines. Now, the statute, to the point you wanted to raise, the statute does refer to calling into service members of the National Guard for the reasons we've discussed, but also the phrase, or execute the laws. So there seems to be some reference in this. There is a reference. There's a plain language reference in the statute to the use of the National Guards to support the execution of the law. So that seems to suggest that, as would be the case had he invoked the Insurrection Act, in language was isn't all that dissimilar, that these National Guards men and women could be called upon to engage in direct enforcement of the law. The memorandum the president issued is vague on that point. There is some language in the memorandum, specifically with reference to both protecting property and the federal function of enforcing the law, that seems compatible or consistent with the potential use of the National Guardsmen and women here to directly support civil enforcement. And that, of course, is precisely what, in general terms, absent the exception, Posse Comitatus was enacted to prohibit. When you add to that the line between direct enforcement of the law and supporting ICE agents in the enforcement of the law through this federal protective function is a potentially blurry line. I don't find 12406 as a measure as comforting as some do, meaning as a sort of sober interim measure, short of invoking the Insurrection Act. I do agree that it would have been cleaner, more direct, had the president wanted to commit clearly the National Guard to the enforcement of the law. I do agree that the appropriate route would have been the invocation of the Insurrection Act. I think there may be political reasons why the president didn't want to do that. I also agree, and it's a point you made to me offline, and I think it's absolutely correct, that it is more likely than not that in order for that enforcement authority that I think is clearly provided for under 12406 to be invoked, and I recognize there's been no practice of doing this in the past, but it could be done on this occasion, the president would have to issue another memorandum to clarify it, in theory. But this goes to my whole point about these legal arguments about the administration, what it's trying to do, what it would do, what it feels constrained in doing. You and I have been writing about this for months. These legal considerations, these norms, these practices don't carry an enormous amount of weight. And the Supreme Court has responded to that. The lower courts have responded to that. And I don't know that I can honestly give the administration the benefit of the doubt in these circumstances where it has not earned it in most other actions that it has taken over the last 5 months.
So I agree with you that you can read 12406, if I'm summarizing correctly, which was the provision that the president used to federalize the National Guard. That you can read that not just to federalize the National Guard, but to authorize, you can read that statute to authorize the National Guard to perform a law enforcement function. And therefore you could read it as getting around the Posse Comitatus statute. And therefore you could read it as saying the president has already invoked an authority that authorizes these federalized troops to do much more than protective power, which was reflected in that memo. I'm going to repeat arguments that we've been talking about for the last few days. You can read it that way. My understanding is, and I'm not an expert here, is that 12406 is in the part of the U.S. Code, and it's always been understood to merely federalize the National Guard and not to provide authorization to do anything more. Now, and that has to do with the history of it. When it was enacted in the early 20th century, it was enacted as part of a reorganization of the National Guard. It was part of a statute that was about federalizing the National Guard and not adding authorities to the National Guard. But I agree that the text of the statute could be read that way. I guess I don't see why it matters. I don't see why it matters because if the president wants to use these troops for law enforcement, he could invoke this statute. I mean, I don't think it would be a very powerful basis for doing so. Because the reasons I just gave and because it doesn't have a history of being used in that way. but he could just as easily and with greater legal soundness invoke the Insurrection Act. So I just don't think it's a hard step or a heavy lift for the president to federalize the National Guard and to use them for law enforcement or to suppress a rebellion, if that's what he wants to do, as opposed just to this protective function. I just don't think it's a heavy lift. So I don't know why they would rely on the weak legal argument rather than the strong legal argument, or the novel legal argument instead of the more settled legal argument. But you might think, well, they don't give a damn about the law anyway, so they might just rely on 12406 instead of the Insurrection Act.
Well, two things about that. First of all, over the last several months, they've repeatedly, in other contexts, relied on weaker rather than stronger arguments and novel rather than accepted arguments. And they've had their head handed to them in a number of respects in the courts for just that reason. So I don't know why they would operate any differently here, particularly where they're so anxious to reap the political benefits of what they're doing here. They just jumped on this opportunity. As far as the Insurrection Act is concerned, that is something they might have at the time thought was a bridge too far. It has a very explosive history, even in his presidency, because of the backdrop of the threat to invoke the Insurrection Act in connection with his challenge to the 2020 election, to suppress any unrest that would have occurred had he successfully persuaded the vice president to either reverse the election in the Senate or to send the delegate slates back to the state legislatures for reconsideration. And they may have thought, why bring that into the case? Right now, they think they're reaping, and we can talk about that in a moment, all the political benefits of doing this without getting into any of that kind of history, without bringing back to people's minds, previous grotesque overreach on the president's part, particularly in attempting to defend his retention of power in 2020. So that could be a reason why they thought we're not going to go to the Insurrection Act here. And they've already got troops on the ground. The other thing that we can talk about is, as you and I've discussed offline, the line between protecting ICE agents in the performance of their federal function and direct involvement by the military in civil enforcement can be a blurry line, can be a very blurry line. And I think you and I agree that the law on that can be kind of complex. I'm not an expert on it. I'm actually trying to educate myself on this right now. But there are ways in which somebody could look at what the military, the Marines, as well as the National Guard are now doing in California and say, boy, it's really hard to see the difference between the protection of endangered ICE agents or federal buildings and their integration into what ICE is doing in a way that suggests that they're lending direct support to law enforcement, which, of course, again, would be what, in principle, absent an exception, posse comitatus prohibits. So that concerns me a great deal. I think it's going to be very hard to tell what exactly they're doing with the military on the ground. It depends on what we see over the next several days.
Yeah. So there's a lot to respond to there. I'll just make a few points. I guess read the situation differently. You're right. They have not, in many circumstances, cared much about legal basis, and sometimes have used more controversial rather than less controversial authorities. I predict they will not do that here. And I don't see any, you talked about political advantage. I don't see, people are not going to be angry. But the thing that's going to anger people, that's going to get people more riled up, is if they use the military in the domestic sphere for law enforcement. If the military starts arresting people and detaining people and using force against people not in a defensive posture, that is what people would be concerned about. And I just don't think that whether it's 12406 or the or 10 U.S. Code, whatever it is, 321, 322, 323, whatever the statutes are, i.e. Insurrection Act or this other statute, I just don't think that's going to matter. I think it's the substance that matters. Second thing is, I don't think they get any advantage from relying on the old statute. They're going to win. They're going to have a much better chance of winning in court if they rely on the Insurrection Act, if they decided to do that. Third, I don't know what the Trump team plans to do. I don't know what their strategy or medium-term game is, if there is one. But it seems to me that the politics, and I wonder what you think about this, are going very well for them right now. with them basically having done nothing with these federal troops other than federalize them and send the Marines to Los Angeles. They've thus far claimed only the authority to be protective and not law enforcement or offensive, so to speak. And second of all, they haven't really done much at all. And the political dangers do rise for the president significantly, I think, if the military and the Federalized National Guard, including the Federalized National Guard, start to take a more aggressive posture on the homeland. So again, I can't handicap or predict what this administration will do. I know it feels very strongly that it has a mandate to fully enforce the federal immigration laws, including broad deportation, as the president ran on. But I just don't see the advantage of, again, we don't know what's going to happen with the protests. We don't know how violent they're going to get. I don't see the advantage to them at all of becoming more aggressive on the military front, but maybe there is one.
By the way, you're certainly right. I mean, a critical flashpoint would be a visual of a member of the National Guard or a Marine arresting, detaining, or questioning somebody, which is, direct engagement in civil enforcement. But they accompany ICE agents on sweeps through facilities to identify and arrest illegal immigrants. They wall off the building while the agents are inside. Are there any number of other activities that will provide visuals of the military being
But
directly
you think
involved?
those visuals would be good or bad for the Trump administration
Well, so let's
if they are um, if they are basically making sure that the ICE agents can do their jobs and making sure that rocks aren't being thrown at the ICE agents and the federal building is not being um, damaged and that rocks in the federal building aren't being thrown at them. You think that if the federalized National Guard is performing that role, that's bad for the Trump administration
Well, it
politically?
depends. It depends on how this develops, and how
Yeah,
intense the situation is, and what people see the military or the guard directly involved in doing.
yeah,
But
I agree.
I do think there's a significant difference between helping ICE enforce the law and protecting an ICE agent from rocks being thrown or a building from being defaced. I think people can understand that difference significantly. I mean, the president has said. I mean, this is again the problem with this demagogic style of presidential leadership. He has said he is liberating the city of Los Angeles from a migrant invasion. That's what he said on a tweet. I'm close to quoting. I don't have it word by word, but that's roughly the idea. So he's sending in troops to liberate the city. That's basically the message that he's sending to the American public, which is a very different message than saying, I'm very worried that the federal courthouse is being damaged, or there are ICE agents who are being injured and I have to make sure they're not being injured. He's casting a much broader political argument that he needs to send troops into LA to liberate it. And, that
Well,
obviously
I think
evokes
he's
a
saying he needs to send troops into LA to allow the officials who were charged with enforcing immigration law to do their jobs. And that so in that sense, in his view, to liberate. But again, we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or the next week. I just think it's extremely difficult to predict. Um, but that hasn't happened yet.
Well, but he's moving down the road. So let me answer the question about the politics, or I mean, by the way, answering the question, do I know how it's going to play out? I really don't. And there's always this enormous danger, and it is, significantly aided and abetted by short-term polling data, some of which is of dubious reliability, and some of which constitutes an immediate public reaction that can change significantly over time. So the politics of this, I think, are completely contingent, ultimately, the success of the politics of what he's doing on what happens next. In the short term, no doubt, he's done several things. Number one, he's taken his dispute with Elon Musk and the disagreement with Musk over the big, beautiful bill off the front page completely. And indeed, has Musk, is, if I am correct about this, tweeting in support of what he's doing in California. So the erstwhile adversaries have come together over this particular episode. That's number one. Number two, he's putting on for his base a show of the strong man who's doing what he said he would do, who goes where other presidents have feared to go. And he's doing it in a red state that, of course, invokes all sorts of strong adverse reactions among his base electorate. It's in California. It's a blue state. There's no cost whatsoever to his beating on the state of California within his particular constituency. He's not doing it in, he's not doing it in Kansas. He's not doing it in Mississippi. He's, et cetera. So that's the second point, is kind of a cost-free beating up
Yeah.
on California. Um, I think this is again, this is not data supported, but I think it is a flag that I would be raising on their side if I could put myself in the position of advising on their side. There is a flag I would raise here about how far he can go without running into serious trouble. And by the way, I think on the domestic side, the tariffs are a good example. You know, he blustered about the tariffs throughout the whole campaign. He quote unquote ran on it. And then people found in practice that it was chaotic and destabilizing, and it caused them a great deal of concern. Here, there is a significant difference between what I think people wanted him to do, which was to be tough on immigration, in particular at the border wall, and making sure people weren't crossing the borders in vast numbers. There wasn't an invasion, and sweeping into American cities with ICE agents in military garb and sort of operating in paramilitary fashion to root out people who may be illegal immigrants, maybe making mistakes along the way, maybe not making mistakes along the way, but right in the heartland of the country, looking to uproot, however they do it, the people that they believe are here illegally. And I don't know that he was elected to do that. It does create the impression of instability, conflict, chaos. And there's one thing he was elected to do, I think clearly. He was elected to create what he calls the greatest economy in the world. Right? That was principally what he was elected to do. And he has his eye on all of the frustrations that he's encountered in producing that result. And this kind of, if you will, bread and circus that he wants to supply them in advance with what we're seeing in California may get him in the short run big points, particularly in the corner of the world where he's been having some political problems recently, but I don't know how it plays for him in the long run.
So I just fundamentally disagree on one point. I don't know how to read what the president, what the scope of the mandate is. But Trump made crystal clear throughout the campaign that it wasn't just about stopping immigration at the border. It was about, I'm paraphrasing, the greatest, largest deportation operation in history. And there was lots of very extreme claims and pledges and rhetoric about that. And I think they're deadly serious about that. And I don't think it, and I think there's a lot of support for it. So I don't think, and I think that they believe there's a lot of support for it, and that's why they're acting the way they're doing. That's why they're acting the way they're acting. Now, it can get out of hand. I agree. And a certain level of getting out of hand, I think plays to their benefit. And I think right now it's playing to their benefit. And I agree if they go too far, it could turn quickly. But I just think that they think, and I think they have support for this, that they have a mandate to, you know, to put it bluntly, rid the country of unlawful immigrants. And that's what they ran on. That's what they're trying to do. We see this in every context. We see this with aggressive use of the INA. We see this with the Alien Enemies Act. We see this with every single thing they're doing. And I just don't think that it's fair to say that it's overstepping the mandate. And that whether they're staying within the law, whether they're acting prudently, those are different things. How it's playing in politics, how far they can go until the politics turn on them. I'm not sure about that, but I think the baseline is it wasn't just about stopping the inflow at the border.
The border piece of it was the easiest for people to picture, and the easiest for people to follow the argument, which is you can't have open borders. He liked to say, if you have no borders, you have no country. And so I think people can understand that. And I think the idea of rooting out, if you will, or enforcing the law against illegal immigrants around the country, immigration around the country, is something that in principle people could rally around. And plus, it gave him an opportunity to communicate sort of the strongman message behind his candidacy. But what we have seen in recent months is the how also matters, how he goes about doing it. And the polls show that, for example, the administration's desire to trample due process along the way has met with an adverse reaction both in the courts and in public opinion polling. Uh, there is that very remarkable story, and I unfortunately cannot remember the state, but it's a red state, of a woman who was here illegally, but has been for many years, raised a family here, worked in a community, who was picked up and detained. And the community rallied behind her. And ultimately, with legal representation, she was released and returned back to the community. I don't know what ultimately awaits her in the rest of sort of in the rest of the legal process. But some of the Trump voters who were interviewed about this said, "Well, that we didn't vote for that. That wasn't what we voted for. I mean, she's a member of our community. Yes, she didn't have her papers in order. That's unfortunate, but you know what? She's been here for many years. She raised her kids here." I just think he is miscalculating the how here. How he's going about doing this could cost him over the long run. And again, I think if it's against the background of not being able to explain where are the 90 trade deals in 90 days, where are the big economic rebound, the launch into a golden age of prosperity that he promised, this sort of thing will last him for a while, but it will not last him, in my view, for a very long time.
I don't know. I can't predict that. I just don't know. I will say, this is the last thing I'll say, that I agree about the due process point, and I agree, and indeed, something we haven't talked about in a while. It's absolutely extraordinary that they brought Abrego Garcia back. Ultimately, doing something they said they wouldn't and couldn't do. And of course, they did so with a distracting way bringing these criminal charges against Abrego Garcia, but they brought him back. They're on very strong ground. They're on much stronger ground as long as they comply with due process and enforcing the immigration laws, including aggressively, and in invoking in the face of significant violence the statutes that we began to talk about. So I don't know. I don't know how it connects up with the economic agenda. I tend to think, although it's way outside my jurisdiction, that economics is ultimately what matters. But I think that they believe they have lots of room to run and a big desire and a mandate to aggressively enforce the immigration laws. And I guess the question that I'll leave us with is how far, we've discussed this a little bit, how far can they go in pushing and bringing the military into the domestic sphere, federalizing the National Guard, using the Marines to support ICE, to take over the law enforcement function? I think the more aggressive that they use the military, the more dangerous it becomes for them politically. And so, certainly a rational administration, I think, if I understand rationality here, would be very cautious in using those authorities. I think thus far they have been very cautious in the way they've described and exercised these authorities, but it could end tomorrow, and I don't know where it's going.
I don't disagree with that. I think we can end on that point of emphatic agreement.
Okay. Thank you, Bob. Have a great day.
You too.